A mother turns her back for 30 seconds to add honey to her tea. When she looks up, her 3-year-old son has vanished from the front yard. No screams, no witnesses, just an empty space where a little boy had been playing moments before. For 53 years, his sister carried the guilt of what she saw that morning. And then, a DNA test revealed something that would shatter everything investigators thought they knew about this case. Before we dive deep into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from today, and let's get into one of the most shocking missing person cases you'll ever hear. The year was 1972. Richard Nixon was president. The Vietnam War still dominated the evening news. Gas cost 36 cents a gallon, and a new house would set you back around $27,000. But in the small city of Springfield, Missouri, tucked away in the southwestern corner of the state, life moved at a different rhythm entirely. This was the heartland of America, where the pace was slower, where neighbors knew each other's names, and where the biggest news of the week might be who won the church bake-off, or which high school football team took home the trophy on Friday night. Springfield in 1972 was a city of just over 100,000 people, large enough to have its own infrastructure, and small enough that everyone seemed to be connected by no more than 2 degrees of separation. The downtown area featured a mix of local businesses that had been family-owned for generations. Hardware stores where the owner would greet you by name. Diners where the waitresses knew your order before you sat down. Barbershops where men gathered not just for a trim but for conversation and community. This was a place where trust was the currency of daily life, where handshake deals still meant something, and where the idea of locking your front door during the daytime seemed almost paranoid. The neighborhoods spreading out from the downtown core were quintessentially American suburbs of that era. Tree-lined streets with modest single-story homes, each with a small front yard and a larger backyard, where families gathered for summer barbecues. Children rode their bicycles freely, disappearing for hours at a time, returning only when the streetlights came on or when their mothers called them home for dinner. There was a collective sense of safety, a communal agreement that everyone looked out for everyone else's children. If a kid scraped their knee 3 houses down, someone's mother would patch them up and send them on their way. If a child wandered too far, a neighbor would gently redirect them home. It was in this environment, this cocoon of Midwestern trust and community, that the Ward family made their home. They lived on the eastern edge of Springfield, in a neighborhood that sat at the border between suburban development and rural farmland. Their house was a simple ranch-style structure, painted a pale yellow with white trim, sitting on a modest plot of land bordered by a white wooden fence that needed a fresh coat of paint but served its purpose well enough. The front yard wasn't large, perhaps 30 feet from the porch to the gate, but it was well maintained with grass that Daniel Ward mowed every Saturday morning without fail. Daniel Ward was 32 years old, in the summer of 1972, a man shaped by hard work and simple values. He had the weathered hands of someone who worked with wood and metal, thick calluses on his palms from years of gripping hammers and saws. He stood about 5 feet 10 inches tall, with broad shoulders and the kind of lean strength that came from physical labor rather than a gym membership. His dark brown hair was always cut short, practical and neat, and his face bore the permanent tan of someone who worked outdoors. Daniel was employed as a carpenter at the local mill, a job he'd held for nearly a decade. He left the house every morning at 6:30, lunch pail in hand, and returned home at 4 in the afternoon, tired but satisfied with an honest day's work. Daniel was a quiet man, not given to lengthy conversations or emotional displays, but those who knew him understood that his silence didn't indicate coldness. He expressed love through action rather than words. He fixed things. He built things. He made sure his family had what they needed. On weekends, he could always be found working on some project around the house, repairing a loose board on the back deck, patching a hole in the fence, or building shelves in the garage. His children learned early that when Dad was working, you didn't interrupt unless it was important, but they also knew that if they needed something built or fixed, Dad would handle it without complaint. Mary Ward was 27 years old that summer, 5 years younger than her husband, and in many ways, his perfect complement. Where Daniel was quiet and reserved, Mary was warm and engaging, The kind of person who could strike up a conversation with anyone and make them feel like an old friend within minutes. She stood about 5 feet 4 inches tall, with light brown hair that she usually wore pulled back in a simple ponytail, and bright blue eyes that seemed to always be smiling. Mary had grown up in Springfield, the daughter of a shopkeeper and a schoolteacher, and she knew nearly everyone in town. She worked part-time at Riverside Bakery on Main Street, taking the morning shift 3 days a week. The job gave her a little extra income and, just as importantly, gave her a reason to get out of the house and interact with the community she loved. Mary was the heart of the Ward household. She was the one who remembered birthdays, who organized family dinners, who made sure everyone had what they needed before they even knew they needed it. She packed Daniel's lunch every morning, making sure to include the oatmeal cookies he loved. She braided her daughter's hair before school and kissed skinned knees to make them better. She sang while she did housework, old songs her mother had taught her, filling the house with a sense of warmth and life. Neighbors often commented on what a lovely family the Wards were, how Mary's laughter could be heard drifting through open windows on summer evenings, how Daniel's steady presence seemed to anchor the household. The Ward children were the center of their parents' universe. Emily Ward was 6 years old in the summer of 1972, a bright, observant child who was counting down the days until she started first grade. She had her mother's blue eyes and her father's quiet thoughtfulness, a combination that made her seem older than her years. Emily loved to draw, spending hours sitting on the front steps with a notebook and crayons, creating elaborate pictures of flowers, animals, and fantastical scenes from her imagination. She was the kind of child who noticed everything, who could tell you what color shirt the mailman was wearing or which neighbor had planted new flowers in their garden. She took her role as big sister seriously, often trying to corral her younger brother when he got too adventurous, calling out warnings when he climbed too high or ran too fast. Jacob Ward was 3 years old that summer, and he was pure energy contained in a small body, with sandy blonde hair that stuck up in odd directions no matter how much his mother tried to comb it down, and hazel eyes that sparkled with mischief. Jacob was the kind of child who seemed to be in constant motion. He had only recently mastered the art of speaking in complete sentences, and he used this new skill with enthusiasm, asking endless questions about everything he saw. Why is the sky blue? Where do birds sleep? Can I have another cookie? His favorite activities included running, jumping, climbing, and generally exploring the world with the fearless curiosity of a child who didn't yet understand that anything could hurt him. Jacob's laugh was infectious, a high-pitched giggle that could make anyone smile. He loved his toy cars, small metal vehicles that he would race across the floor, making engine noises with his mouth. He loved helping his father, even though his help usually consisted of handing Daniel tools that weren't quite the right ones, or holding boards that didn't need to be held. He adored his big sister Emily, following her around the house and yard like a devoted puppy, wanting to be included in whatever she was doing. And he loved his mother with the uncomplicated devotion of a 3-year-old, running to her for hugs and comfort whenever the world seemed too big or too scary. The Ward family's daily routine was predictable and comfortable, the kind of rhythm that families fall into when life is good and stable. Daniel would wake at 5:30 every morning, shower, and dress in his work clothes, sturdy jeans, and a plain cotton shirt. Mary would wake shortly after, starting the coffee pot and beginning to prepare breakfast. By 6 o'clock, the smell of bacon and eggs would fill the house, and the children would begin to stir. Emily usually woke on her own, padding into the kitchen in her pajamas to help set the table. Jacob required more coaxing, and Mary would often have to go into his room and gently shake him awake, promising pancakes or whatever his current favorite breakfast food happened to be. Breakfast was eaten together at the kitchen table, a non-negotiable rule in the Ward household. Daniel believed that families who ate together stayed together, and even though he had to leave for work shortly after, those 20 minutes of shared breakfast were sacred. They would talk about their plans for the day. Emily would tell them about what she hoped to do. Daniel would mention if he'd be working late, and Mary would discuss what errands she needed to run. After breakfast, Daniel would kiss Mary goodbye, ruffle Emily's hair, and lift Jacob up for a hug before heading out the door, lunch pail in hand. Once Daniel left, Mary would begin her housework routine. Dishes needed washing. Beds needed making. Laundry needed to be done. On days when she had to work at the bakery, she would do the most essential tasks quickly, then get the children dressed and ready. On her days off, she moved at a more leisurely pace, often letting the children play while she worked, keeping an eye on them through the windows. Emily was generally content to occupy herself with her drawings or her dolls, setting up elaborate scenarios that she would narrate to herself in a quiet voice. Jacob required more supervision, as his idea of play often involved potential danger, climbing on furniture or trying to reach things on high shelves. The front yard became the children's domain during the warmer months. Mary preferred them to play outside, where she could see them from the kitchen window, and the children loved the freedom of the outdoors. Emily would bring her notebook and crayons to the front steps, creating her art while keeping a watchful eye on her little brother. Jacob would run back and forth across the yard, playing with his toy cars, occasionally stopping to examine a bug or a flower or whatever else caught his attention. The white wooden fence that bordered the property gave Mary a sense of security. It wasn't tall enough to completely contain an adventurous 3-year-old, but the gate had a latch that Jacob couldn't quite reach yet, and Mary felt confident that as long as the gate was latched, her children were safe in that enclosed space. But in the week leading up to June 23, 1972, something had changed in the neighborhood. It was subtle at first, the kind of thing that people noticed but didn't really think about, the kind of detail that only becomes significant in hindsight. A light blue Ford pickup truck had begun appearing on their street, cruising slowly past houses, sometimes parking for a few minutes before moving on. Several neighbors mentioned seeing it, discussing it in the casual way people discuss anything unusual but not necessarily alarming. Mrs. Henderson, who lived 3 houses down and spent much of her day watching the street from her front window, had seen the truck at least 4 times that week. She mentioned it to her husband over dinner, noting that it seemed odd for a truck to drive so slowly, almost as if the driver was looking for a specific address but couldn't quite find it. Mr. Peterson, who worked nights and slept during the day, had been woken by the sound of a truck idling in front of his house one afternoon. He'd looked out the window, annoyed at the noise, and seen the light blue Ford sitting there, the driver obscured by the glare of the sun on the windshield. After a few minutes, the truck had driven away, and Mr. Peterson had gone back to bed, thinking nothing more of it. The truck had been seen near the Ward property at least twice that week. Once on Monday morning, around 10 o'clock, it had driven slowly along the fence line, the driver appearing to look at the house. Mary had been inside doing laundry and hadn't noticed. Another time, on Wednesday afternoon, the truck had been parked across the street from the Ward house for approximately 10 minutes. Daniel had seen it when he arrived home from work, but he assumed it was a contractor or a delivery person checking an address, and he thought nothing of it. After all, Springfield was the kind of place where work trucks were common. Construction workers, electricians, plumbers, delivery drivers, all drove similar vehicles, and it wasn't unusual to see unfamiliar trucks in residential neighborhoods. This was one of the tragic ironies of the case that would unfold. In a community built on trust, where strangers were given the benefit of the doubt, where the default assumption was that people had good intentions, warning signs could be missed. The light blue Ford pickup wasn't threatening on its own. The slow driving could be explained away. The repeated appearances could be coincidental. It was only later, when tragedy had already struck, that these details would be pieced together into a pattern that might have been prevented if only someone had paid closer attention, if only someone had thought to question, if only someone had acted. But in the moment, in that week before everything changed, life continued normally for the Ward family. Daniel went to work. Mary took care of the house and the children. Emily drew her pictures. Jacob played with his cars. The sun rose and set. Meals were cooked and eaten. The world turned on its axis, and nobody knew that time was running out, that a clock was ticking down toward a moment that would shatter this family and haunt a community for decades to come. June 23, 1972, began as an unremarkable Friday morning. The sun rose at approximately 5:47 a.m., painting the sky in shades of pink and orange before settling into the clear blue that promised a beautiful summer day. The temperature was already climbing toward what would be a high of 86 degrees, warm but not uncomfortably hot, with a gentle breeze that rustled the leaves on the oak trees that lined the street. It was the kind of morning that made people grateful to live in the Midwest, when the humidity was low and the air felt fresh and clean. Daniel Ward woke at his usual time, 5:30 a.m., his internal clock so reliable that he rarely needed an alarm. He showered, shaved, and dressed in his work clothes, mentally running through the tasks he needed to complete at the mill that day. There was a large order of custom shelving that needed to be finished by the end of the week, and Daniel took pride in meeting deadlines. He went into the kitchen, where Mary was already awake and starting the coffee, her hair still mussed from sleep, wearing the blue cotton robe she'd had since before they were married. They exchanged good mornings, the comfortable greeting of people who'd been together long enough that words weren't always necessary. Mary cracked eggs into a bowl while Daniel poured himself coffee, black with no sugar, the way he'd always taken it. By 6 o'clock, breakfast was ready. Bacon, scrambled eggs, and toast with butter and strawberry jam. Emily wandered in, still wearing her pajamas decorated with little yellow ducks, and climbed into her usual chair. Mary had to go wake Jacob, who was sprawled across his bed, one arm hanging off the edge, still deeply asleep despite the sun streaming through his window. Breakfast was eaten with the usual conversation. Emily announced that she wanted to draw pictures of butterflies today because she'd seen one in the yard yesterday and it was very pretty. Jacob, still groggy, mostly focused on his food, occasionally looking up to ask for more juice or to tell them about a dream he'd had that involved dinosaurs and ice cream, a combination that made sense only to a 3-year-old's logic. Daniel mentioned that he might be home a bit late because they were behind schedule on the shelving project, and Mary nodded, making a mental note to keep dinner warm if needed. At 6:30, Daniel kissed Mary goodbye, the quick peck on the lips that had been their morning ritual for years. He tousled Emily's hair, making her laugh and swat at his hand, and he scooped Jacob up for a hug, the little boy wrapping his arms around his father's neck and squeezing tight. Daniel set him back down, grabbed his lunch pail from the counter, and headed out the front door. Mary stood on the porch and waved as he backed his truck out of the driveway. Another routine gesture in a morning full of routines. With Daniel gone, Mary began the day's housework. Dishes needed washing, and she filled the sink with hot, soapy water, letting them soak while she went to make the beds. Emily and Jacob wandered into the living room, Emily settling on the couch with her coloring books, Jacob pulling out his toy cars and beginning to race them across the floor, making engine noises and crash sounds. Mary moved through the house with practiced efficiency, stripping sheets from beds, gathering dirty clothes for laundry, wiping down bathroom counters, all the small tasks that kept a household running. By 8 o'clock, the morning chores were mostly complete, and Mary decided to start a load of laundry. The washing machine was in a small room off the kitchen, and she loaded it with whites, added detergent, and set it to run. The rhythmic sound of water filling the machine provided a background soundtrack to the morning. She returned to the kitchen and began preparing ingredients for the pie she planned to bake later. Friday was pie day in the Ward household, a tradition Mary had established when Emily was a baby. Sometimes it was apple, sometimes cherry, sometimes peach when they were in season. Today she was planning a strawberry rhubarb pie, Daniel's favorite. Around 9 o'clock, Mary suggested that Emily and Jacob go play outside. The morning was beautiful, and she believed fresh air and sunshine were good for children. Emily gathered her notebook and crayons, excited to attempt drawing the butterflies she'd mentioned at breakfast. Jacob grabbed 2 of his favorite toy cars, a red one and a blue one, both showing the wear and tear of being a 3-year-old's constant companions. Mary opened the front door and watched as the children made their way into the yard, Emily settling onto the second step of the porch, Jacob immediately running toward the middle of the yard, where he proceeded to race his cars through the grass. Mary returned to the kitchen, satisfied that she could keep an eye on the children through the window while she worked. She began mixing the pie crust, cutting cold butter into flour, working it with her hands until it reached the right crumbly consistency. She filled a glass with cold water, keeping it nearby to add tablespoons as needed. The kitchen window provided a perfect view of most of the front yard, and she glanced out frequently, a habit ingrained through years of parenting. She could see Emily's blonde head bent over her notebook, could see Jacob's constant motion as he ran back and forth. The morning continued peacefully. Mary finished the pie crust and set it in the refrigerator to chill. She prepared the filling, mixing sliced strawberries and chopped rhubarb with sugar and a bit of flour to thicken it. She washed the dishes, dried them, and put them away. She glanced out the window and saw Emily showing something in her notebook to Jacob, who had paused in his play to look at his sister's drawing. Mary smiled, treasuring these moments when her children got along perfectly, when the age difference didn't matter and they were simply brother and sister enjoying each other's company. Around 9:45, Mary decided to make herself a cup of tea. She filled the kettle with water and set it on the stove to boil. While she waited, she went to check on the laundry, transferring the wet clothes from the washer to the dryer. The dryer was old and temperamental, and she had to jiggle the dial just right to get it to start. It finally rumbled to life, and she returned to the kitchen, where the kettle was beginning to whistle. She poured the hot water over a tea bag in her favorite mug, the one with the faded flowers that Emily had given her for Mother's Day last year. Mary stood at the kitchen counter, blowing on the hot tea to cool it, looking out the window at her children. Emily was still on the steps, now lying on her stomach, with her notebook in front of her, her legs kicking in the air behind her. Jacob was closer to the fence than he had been, near the gate, crouched down, examining something on the ground, probably an insect or an interesting rock. Mary took a sip of tea, appreciating the quiet moment, the simple pleasure of a peaceful morning in her own home. She turned away from the window to add a spoonful of honey to her tea. It couldn't have been more than 30 seconds, perhaps 45 at most. She stirred the honey, watching it dissolve into the amber liquid, then set the spoon in the sink. She picked up the mug, intending to take it to the living room where she could sit down for a few minutes and actually enjoy it. But something made her glance out the window one more time, that sixth sense that mothers develop, the instinct that tells them when something isn't quite right. Emily was still on the steps, but she was sitting up now, her notebook forgotten beside her, staring toward the gate with an expression that Mary couldn't quite read from inside the house. Mary's eyes immediately went to where Jacob had been, near the gate, but he wasn't there. Her heart gave a small lurch, the automatic response of a parent who momentarily can't see their child. She scanned the yard, expecting to see him behind a bush or around the side of the house. Nothing. She set the mug down hard on the counter, tea sloshing over the side, and strode quickly toward the front door. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. Mary pushed open the screen door, stepping onto the porch, her eyes still searching the yard. Emily turned to look at her mother, and Mary saw something in her daughter's face that sent a chill down her spine despite the warm morning air. Fear. Confusion. Emily's blue eyes were wide, her mouth slightly open as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. "Where's Jacob?" Mary asked, trying to keep her voice calm, even as her pulse began to race. "Emily, where's your brother?" Emily lifted one small hand and pointed toward the street, toward the gate that Mary could now see was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. "A man," Emily said, her voice small and uncertain. "A man talked to him." Mary's blood turned to ice. She ran down the steps, across the yard, through the open gate, and into the street. Her head swiveled left, then right, searching desperately for any sign of her son. The street was empty. No cars, no people. No 3-year-old boy with sandy blonde hair and a toy car in each hand. The street stretched out in both directions. Quiet suburban houses with neat lawns and trimmed hedges, and absolutely no sign of Jacob. "Jacob!" Mary screamed, her voice cracking with panic. "Jacob! Baby! Where are you?" She ran down the street, still calling his name, her head turning constantly, checking every yard, every driveway, every possible place a small child might be. Behind her, Emily had come down the steps and was standing at the gate, tears beginning to stream down her face, frightened by her mother's obvious terror. Mary ran to the nearest house, the Morrisons' place, and pounded on the door. Mrs. Morrison, an elderly woman who babysat neighborhood children, opened the door with a concerned expression. "Mary, what's wrong? Have you seen Jacob? Did you see anyone outside? A man? A car?" Mary's words tumbled out in a frantic rush. Mrs. Morrison shook her head, confusion evident on her weathered face. "No, dear. I haven't seen anyone. I've been in the back room knitting." "What's happened?" But Mary was already moving. running to the next house. Then the next, pounding on doors, asking the same desperate questions, getting the same negative answers. She ran back to her own house, burst inside, and grabbed the telephone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely dial the rotary phone. She dialed 0 for the operator. "Operator," came the calm, professional voice on the other end. "My son is missing," Mary cried. "My 3-year-old son. He was in the front yard and now he's gone. I need the police. Please, I need the police right now." "Ma'am, please stay calm. I'm connecting you to the police department now." The line clicked, then rang once before a male voice answered. "Springfield Police Department. Officer Mitchell speaking." Mary tried to control her voice, tried to speak clearly, even though her heart was hammering in her chest and her breath was coming in short gasps. "My son is missing. His name is Jacob Ward. He's 3 years old. He was playing in our front yard and now he's gone. Someone took him. My daughter saw a man. Please, you have to help me find him." Officer Mitchell's voice became immediately alert and focused. "Ma'am, I need you to give me your address. How long has he been missing?" 206 Elm Street. "He's only been gone a few minutes. Maybe 5 minutes. Maybe less. I don't know. My daughter, Emily. She's 6. She said a man talked to him and then he was gone. Please, you have to send someone right now. Ma'am, I'm dispatching officers to your location immediately. I need you to stay at your house in case he comes back. Can you do that for me?" Mary wanted to say no, wanted to scream that she needed to be out looking, not sitting in her house waiting, but she forced herself to nod even though he couldn't see her. Yes, I'll stay here. But please hurry. Please. Officers are on their way. They'll be there in less than 5 minutes." Mary hung up the phone and ran back outside, unable to bear being inside when her son was out there somewhere. Emily was still standing at the gate, crying quietly, her arms wrapped around herself. Mary scooped her up, holding her tight, trying to provide comfort even though she herself was falling apart inside. The next 5 minutes felt like an eternity. Mary stood in her front yard, holding Emily, scanning the street constantly, praying to see Jacob come running around a corner, chasing a dog or a butterfly, having simply wandered further than he should have. But the street remained empty and quiet, almost accusingly peaceful, as if nothing terrible had happened, as if the world should have stopped turning the moment her son disappeared. Then, she heard the sirens, growing louder, and 2 police cars came racing down Elm Street, lights flashing. They pulled to a stop in front of the Ward house, and 4 officers jumped out. Mary set Emily down and ran to meet them, the words pouring out of her in a torrent. "He's 3 years old, sandy blonde hair. He's wearing a red shirt and blue shorts. He has hazel eyes. He was playing right there in the yard. And then he was gone. My daughter saw a man. Someone took him. Please, you have to find him." The officer who'd been driving the first car, a tall man with graying hair and kind eyes, put a hand on Mary's shoulder. "Ma'am, I'm Sergeant Davis. We're going to find your son. I need you to take a slow breath and tell me exactly what happened." Mary tried to calm herself, tried to organize her thoughts into something coherent. She explained how Jacob had been playing in the yard, how she'd gone inside to make tea, how when she looked back out the window he was gone. She pointed to Emily. She saw something. She said a man talked to him. Sergeant Davis knelt down so he was at Emily's eye level. "Hi there, sweetheart. I'm Sergeant Davis. Can you tell me what you saw?" Emily, still crying but trying to be brave, wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "Jacob was by the gate, and a man came. He talked to Jacob, and then they walked away." "Can you describe the man, honey? What did he look like?" Emily's face scrunched up in concentration. "He was tall, taller than Daddy. He was wearing a dark jacket, I think. It looked hot for a jacket." "That's very good, Emily. You're being very helpful. Did you see which way they went?" Emily pointed down the street, in the direction away from town. "That way, but I didn't see very far because I was drawing, and when I looked up they were already far away." "Did you see a car? A truck?" Emily shook her head. "I don't know. I don't think so. But maybe. I was trying to finish my butterfly." Sergeant Davis stood up and immediately began issuing orders to the other officers. "Johnson, radio for backup. I want every available unit in this neighborhood within 10 minutes. Rodriguez, start canvassing the houses. Someone might have seen something. Mitchell, get on the phone to dispatch. I want a description of the boy broadcast to every unit in the city. He turned back to Mary. Ma'am, I need a recent photo of Jacob if you have one. Mary nodded frantically and ran inside, her mind racing. Photos. Where were the photos? The living room. She kept a photo album on the bookshelf. She grabbed it and flipped through with shaking hands, finding a picture taken just last month at Emily's birthday party. Jacob was smiling at the camera, his sandy blonde hair catching the sunlight, his hazel eyes bright with happiness. She pulled it from the album and ran back outside, thrusting it at Sergeant Davis. He looked at the photo, and something in his expression softened for just a moment before the professional mask came back. Okay, we're going to find him. Mrs. Ward, tell me, has there been anything unusual in the neighborhood recently? Any strangers? Any vehicles that didn't belong? Mary's eyes widened as the memory hit her. The truck. There's been a light blue pickup truck. I've seen it a couple of times this week, driving slowly. I thought it was just someone looking for an address. Sergeant Davis's expression became even more focused. What kind of truck? Did you see a license plate? A Ford, I think. I don't know trucks very well. And no, I never saw the plate clearly. Has anyone else in the neighborhood seen this truck? I don't know. Maybe. Mrs. Henderson might have. She's always watching the street. Sergeant Davis sent Rodriguez to question Mrs. Henderson and the other neighbors. Within minutes, more police cars arrived, and suddenly the quiet street was filled with uniforms and radios crackling with urgent communications. Officers spread out, knocking on every door, searching every yard, checking every garage and shed. The descriptions went out over police radio and were relayed to every unit in Springfield. 3-year-old boy, sandy blonde hair, hazel eyes, red shirt, blue shorts, last seen at 9:45 a.m. on Elm Street, possibly taken by a male subject driving a light blue Ford pickup truck. Daniel Ward received the phone call at 10:15 a.m. He was in the middle of cutting a piece of oak when his supervisor came and told him there was an emergency call. Daniel's hand started shaking before he even picked up the receiver, because emergency calls during work hours never meant anything good. When he heard Mary's voice, broken and barely coherent through her sobs, telling him that Jacob was gone, that someone had taken him, Daniel felt his legs go weak. He told his supervisor he had to leave immediately, didn't even stop to grab his lunch pail or clock out, just ran to his truck and drove home faster than he'd ever driven in his life, running 2 red lights and nearly causing an accident in his desperation to get there. When he screeched to a stop in front of his house and saw the police cars and officers everywhere, the full reality of the situation hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't Jacob wandering off and getting lost. This was real. His son was missing. Someone had taken his son. Mary ran to him, and they held each other in the middle of the yard, while all around them, the machinery of law enforcement kicked into higher and higher gear. More officers arrived. A command post was set up in their living room. Detectives began taking detailed statements. A description of the light blue Ford pickup was broadcast, not just citywide, but statewide. The FBI was notified, as was standard procedure in potential child abductions, though they wouldn't officially join the investigation unless certain criteria were met. The neighborhood was transformed from a quiet suburban street into a crime scene. Yellow tape went up around the Ward property. Officers walked the street with photographs of Jacob, showing them to everyone they encountered. Tracking dogs were brought in, German shepherds that sniffed Jacob's clothing and then were released to follow any scent they could find. The dogs tracked to the gate, then to the street, then seemed to lose the scent, indicating that Jacob had likely been put into a vehicle at that point. Emily was questioned again, this time by a detective trained in interviewing child witnesses. They sat in Emily's bedroom, and the detective, a woman named Sandra Keller, who had a gentle voice and warm smile, asked Emily to tell her everything she remembered, no matter how small or unimportant it seemed. Emily tried her best, but she was 6 years old and scared, and kept bursting into tears. The man had been tall. He'd been wearing dark clothes, maybe a dark jacket or dark shirt. She didn't see his face clearly because he was too far away, and she wasn't really paying attention until it was too late. She thought maybe he had dark hair, but she wasn't sure. She didn't see a car or truck. She didn't hear what the man said to Jacob. She just saw him talking, and then Jacob walking toward the gate with him, and then they were gone. Detective Keller asked if Emily had ever seen this man before. Emily shook her head no. Had she seen the blue truck her mother mentioned? Emily wasn't sure. Maybe. She thought maybe she'd seen a truck, but she didn't know if it was blue or not. The detective didn't push too hard, understanding that pressuring a child witness could lead to false memories or statements made just to please the adults. She thanked Emily for being so brave and helpful, and assured her that everyone was working very hard to find Jacob. By noon, the search had expanded dramatically. Volunteers from the community began showing up, dozens of people who'd heard what happened and wanted to help. They were organized into search teams and given specific areas to cover, walking through fields and wooded areas, checking behind buildings and in culverts, anywhere a small child might be hidden or might have wandered. Flyers were hastily printed with Jacob's photo and description, and volunteers began posting them on telephone poles, in store windows, on community bulletin boards. The local television station interrupted regular programming with a news bulletin. The young reporter, standing in front of the ward house with police activity visible behind him, informed viewers that a massive search was underway for 3-year-old Jacob Ward, who had disappeared from his front yard that morning. They showed Jacob's photo and described him, and they asked anyone with information to contact the Springfield Police Department immediately. Within an hour, the tip line was flooded with calls, most of them well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful. People reporting children who resembled Jacob but turned out to be neighborhood kids, or recounting vehicles they'd seen that might or might not match the description of the blue Ford truck. The afternoon stretched into evening with no breaks in the case. Daniel and Mary remained at their house, surrounded by police and detectives, answering questions over and over, providing every detail they could think of about Jacob's routine, his habits, his favorite places, anything that might help find him. Mary kept breaking down, dissolving into tears, and Daniel would hold her, his own face a mask of barely controlled anguish. Emily stayed with a neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who tried to distract the girl with cookies and television, but Emily just sat quietly, staring out the window, replaying the scene from that morning over and over in her mind. As darkness fell, and Jacob had been missing for nearly 12 hours, the mood among the investigators began to shift. Statistics were grim when it came to child abductions. The first few hours were critical, and those hours had now passed. Sergeant Davis, who'd been coordinating the search efforts, gathered his team for a briefing. They reviewed everything they knew, which wasn't much. A 3-year-old boy taken from his front yard. A male suspect, tall, wearing dark clothing. A possible vehicle, a light blue Ford pickup. And no witnesses except a 6-year-old girl who'd been focused on her drawing and hadn't seen clearly. The blue Ford pickup had become the primary lead, simply because it was the only concrete detail they had. Officers were tasked with locating every light blue Ford pickup in Greene County and questioning the owners. The problem was that Ford pickups were among the most common vehicles in Missouri in 1972. Every third farmer seemed to own one, along with contractors, delivery drivers, and regular citizens. The task was massive, but it had to be done. Detectives began developing theories. The most likely scenario, given the circumstances, was that this was a planned abduction by someone who'd been watching the Ward family, someone who knew Jacob's routine and had waited for an opportunity. The blue truck seen multiple times in the neighborhood over the preceding week supported this theory. It suggested surveillance, planning, intent. This wasn't a random crime of opportunity. This was calculated. But why Jacob? That was the question everyone kept coming back to. The Ward family wasn't wealthy. There'd been no ransom demand, which ruled out kidnapping for money. Was this a predator who'd targeted a vulnerable child? The thought made everyone involved in the investigation feel sick, but it had to be considered. Or was there some other motive, something personal, that the family wasn't aware of? Detectives dug into Daniel and Mary's backgrounds, looking for anyone who might have a grudge, any past conflicts that could have led to someone targeting their child for revenge. They found nothing. Daniel Ward was exactly what he appeared to be, a quiet, hard-working man who got along with his coworkers, paid his bills on time, and had no enemies that anyone could identify. Mary was beloved in the community, known for her kindness and warmth. They attended church occasionally but weren't particularly religious. They had no significant debts. They'd never been involved in any legal disputes. Their life was unremarkably normal, which made the abduction of their son all the more inexplicable. By midnight, over 200 volunteers were still searching, using flashlights to scan areas that had already been covered during daylight hours. The mood was somber. Everyone knew that the longer Jacob remained missing, the less likely it was they'd find him alive. But nobody said that out loud. Instead, they kept searching, driven by hope and determination and the belief that they couldn't give up on a 3-year-old child. Mary Ward didn't sleep that night. She sat in Jacob's room, surrounded by his toys and his clothes, holding his favorite stuffed animal, a worn teddy bear named Mr. Brown. She rocked back and forth, whispering prayers and promises, telling the empty room that she'd never stopped looking, that she'd find him, that she'd bring him home. Daniel stood in the doorway, watching his wife fall apart, feeling utterly helpless. He'd built things with his hands his entire life. He'd fixed problems and solved issues through practical action. But this was something he couldn't fix. This was a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Emily, spending the night at Mrs. Henderson's house, lay awake in the guest bedroom, staring at the ceiling. She kept thinking about that morning, kept running through those few seconds when she'd looked up from her drawing and seen Jacob near the gate. If only she'd been paying better attention. If only she'd called out to him sooner. If only she'd told her mother immediately, instead of freezing in confusion. The burden of guilt was enormous for a 6-year-old, and it would shape the rest of her life in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. June 24th dawned bright and clear. Another beautiful summer morning that felt obscene given the circumstances. The search resumed at first light, now including helicopters that flew grid patterns over the area, their crews scanning the ground below for any sign of a small boy. Dive teams were deployed to search ponds and creeks, a grim necessity that everyone hoped would prove fruitless. Roadblocks were set up on major highways, leading out of Springfield, and officers stopped vehicles matching the description of the blue Ford truck. Though by now everyone acknowledged that if the abductor had any sense, he'd have switched vehicles or altered his truck's appearance. The case was now officially an FBI investigation. Agents arrived from Kansas City, bringing with them resources and expertise in child abduction cases. They set up in the Springfield Police Department, creating a task force that combined local knowledge with federal capabilities. Special Agent Richard Coleman, a veteran of the FBI's relatively new behavioral science unit, flew in from Quantico to assist. He reviewed all the evidence and witness statements, then presented a profile of the likely abductor. The suspect, Coleman suggested, was probably a white male, between 25 and 45 years old. Likely someone who lived in or near Springfield, someone who'd had the opportunity to observe the Ward family over time. The surveillance indicated by the blue truck sightings suggested someone organized and patient, someone capable of controlling his impulses long enough to plan rather than act impulsively. The fact that he'd approached in broad daylight suggested confidence, possibly arrogance. He might have a prior history of crimes against children, though possibly nothing that had led to arrest or conviction. He likely lived alone, or with someone who didn't monitor his activities closely. This profile was helpful for directing investigative resources, but it still described potentially hundreds of men in the area. Detectives began the painstaking work of creating lists. Men with prior sex offenses, men who'd been reported for suspicious behavior around children, men who lived alone within a 10-mile radius of the Ward house, men who drove Ford pickups, men who worked jobs that gave them mobility and freedom during daytime hours. The lists were long, and each name had to be investigated, interviews conducted, alibis verified. Days turned into weeks. The massive volunteer search efforts gradually diminished as people had to return to their normal lives, though a core group of dedicated searchers continued to spend their weekends combing through remote areas. The wall in the police station war room became covered with maps and photos and timelines, a visual representation of an investigation that was generating enormous amounts of information, but precious few actual leads. Tips continued to pour in, Someone had seen a blue truck in a neighboring county. Someone remembered a strange man at a playground 3 months ago. Someone had a nephew who'd been acting oddly lately. Each tip had to be investigated. Each one took time and resources, and almost all of them led nowhere. It was frustrating, exhausting work, made worse by the knowledge that somewhere out there, Jacob Ward's fate was already sealed, and they were racing against a clock that might have already run out. The Ward family's life had been completely upended. Daniel had taken leave from his job, unable to focus on anything but finding his son. Mary barely functioned, moving through each day in a haze of grief and terror. She'd stopped working at the bakery. She barely ate or slept. Friends and neighbors brought food that sat untouched in the kitchen. The house that had been filled with laughter and life just weeks ago now felt like a tomb, silent except for Mary's occasional sobs. Emily returned home after a few days, but she was a changed child. She stopped drawing. She barely spoke. She'd wake up screaming from nightmares, and Mary would rush to her room to hold her while she cried, apologizing over and over for not watching Jacob more carefully. Mary tried to tell Emily that it wasn't her fault, that she was just a little girl and couldn't have known what was happening. But Emily carried the guilt like a physical weight. As June became July, a terrible reality began to settle over the investigation. Without new leads, without evidence, without witnesses, the case was going cold. Detectives were still working it, still following up on tips, still investigating persons of interest, but the energy and resources that had been thrown at the case in those first crucial days were being gradually redirected to other matters. It wasn't that anyone stopped caring. It wasn't that anyone stopped wanting to find Jacob. It was simply that there was nowhere else to look, nothing else to do. The blue Ford truck remained a focus, but despite interviewing hundreds of truck owners, despite checking repair shops and dealerships, despite reviewing every traffic citation issued in the weeks before and after the abduction, they never found the specific truck that had been seen in the Ward neighborhood. It had vanished as completely as Jacob himself, leading some investigators to speculate that maybe the truck had been stolen, used for the abduction, and then abandoned or destroyed. Theories multiplied in the absence of evidence. Maybe the abductor had been passing through Springfield and had taken Jacob on impulse, despite the surveillance suggesting otherwise. Maybe the man seen near the gate wasn't the abductor at all, but a witness who'd left the scene without coming forward. Maybe Jacob had somehow wandered away on his own and something else entirely had happened to him. The problem with theories was that without evidence, they were just speculation, and speculation didn't bring Jacob home. By August, the case was featured on the evening news less frequently. By September, it had largely disappeared from public consciousness, replaced by new tragedies and concerns. The posters with Jacob's photo that had covered Springfield began to fade and tear, eventually being taken down or covered over by advertisements and new posters for other causes. Life, as it inevitably does, moved on for everyone except the Ward family. Daniel eventually returned to work, needing the income and needing something to occupy his mind besides the endless loop of questions and what-ifs. Mary tried to resume some semblance of normal life, cooking meals and cleaning the house, but she was a ghost of her former self. She'd aged years in just months, her face drawn and pale, her eyes haunted. She left Jacob's room exactly as it had been the morning he disappeared, unable to change anything, maintaining it like a shrine to a little boy who might never come home. Emily started first grade in the fall, a milestone her mother had once looked forward to, but now barely acknowledged. Emily was quiet at school, keeping to herself, not making friends. The other children knew what had happened to her brother. Everyone in Springfield knew, and they treated her with a mixture of pity and curiosity that Emily found suffocating. She'd sit at her desk and stare out the window, wondering where Jacob was, if he was scared, if he was calling for her and their parents, if he was even still alive. The first anniversary of Jacob's disappearance came and went. There was a small memorial service at the local church, attended by family, close friends, and a few detectives who were still actively working the case. Mary broke down completely during the service, having to be helped out by Daniel and her sister. The pastor spoke about faith and hope and trusting in God's plan, but the words felt empty to everyone present. What kind of plan involved stealing a 3-year-old from his front yard? Sergeant Davis, who'd responded to Mary's initial call and had remained deeply invested in the case, gave a brief statement to the press outside the church. He said that the investigation was still active, that tips were still being followed, that they'd never stop looking for Jacob Ward. But even as he said it, he knew that short of a miracle, or a confession, or someone stumbling across evidence by pure chance, the case would likely never be solved. It happened sometimes. Cases went cold, children vanished, families were destroyed, and the world kept turning despite the injustice of it all. As 1972 became 1973, life continued its inexorable march forward. The Ward family endured, because that's what they had to do, but they didn't truly live. They existed in a state of suspended animation, unable to move forward because doing so felt like giving up on Jacob, unable to move backward because the past was too painful to dwell on. They were trapped in an eternal present, defined by absence and loss. Emily grew older, but she never forgot that morning. As she moved through elementary school and into middle school, the memory remained vivid, sometimes fading slightly but never truly disappearing. She'd dream about Jacob frequently, sometimes happy dreams where he was safe and playing, sometimes nightmares where she saw him being taken but was paralyzed and couldn't scream for help. She never stopped feeling guilty, never stopped believing that if she'd just been paying closer attention, if she'd called out sooner, if she'd run to tell her mother immediately, maybe Jacob would still be with them. The detectives working the case changed over the years as some retired and others transferred. Each new detective would review the files, spend some time investigating fresh angles or following up on old leads, but they all eventually reached the same conclusion. Without new evidence, without a witness coming forward, without someone confessing, the case was unsolvable. Jacob Ward had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed, leaving behind only grief and questions, and a family that would never be whole again. Daniel Ward's health began to decline in his 50s. The stress and grief had taken a physical toll, manifesting in heart problems that would eventually prove fatal. He died in 1998 at the age of 58, having spent 26 years wondering what had happened to his son. Mary believed that he died of a broken heart as much as heart disease, that the loss of Jacob had slowly killed him over the years. At the funeral, Emily, now 32 years old herself, looked at her father in his casket and thought about how he'd never gotten closure, never gotten answers, never gotten to know whether his son had lived or died. Mary Ward lived longer, making it into the 21st century, but she was never the same after Jacob's disappearance. The vibrant, laughing woman who'd filled her home with warmth and love had been replaced by someone fragile and sad, someone who looked at other people's grandchildren with an expression of such longing it was painful to witness. She spent her final years in a nursing home, her mind gradually failing, but even in her confusion, she'd sometimes call out for Jacob, believing he was a little boy again, and wondering where he'd gone. When Mary died in 2011 at the age of 66, Emily was left as the sole survivor of the immediate Ward family. She'd married and had children of her own, 2 daughters who grew up hearing stories about the uncle they'd never met, the little boy who'd vanished when their mother was just 6 years old. Emily had tried to build a good life, despite the tragedy that had shaped her childhood. She'd become a teacher, perhaps in some unconscious attempt to protect and care for children the way she felt she'd failed to protect Jacob. But she never truly moved past that June morning in 1972. The case file for Jacob Ward sat in the Springfield Police Department's cold case storage, one box among hundreds, gathering dust. Occasionally, a new detective would pull it out, review the contents, and shake their head at the lack of evidence. The witnesses were an unreliable 6-year-old, and some neighbors who'd seen a truck. The physical evidence was non-existent. The leads had all been exhausted decades ago. It was a case that would almost certainly never be solved. A mystery that would remain unsolved until everyone who remembered Jacob Ward was gone. But Emily remembered, and Emily never stopped hoping. Even as the years turned into decades, even as the world changed in ways that would have been unimaginable in 1972, even as technology advanced and DNA databases were created, and cold cases all over the country were being solved through new forensic techniques, Emily held on to a belief that somewhere, somehow, Jacob was still alive. It wasn't logical. It wasn't based on evidence. It was simply a feeling, a bone-deep conviction, that she would have known if her brother had died, that she would have felt it somehow. She believed he was out there, living under a different name, maybe not even knowing he'd been taken, maybe having no memory of his original family, but alive. Her husband thought she was torturing herself with false hope. Her therapist suggested that her refusal to accept Jacob's likely death was preventing her from achieving closure. Her friends gently suggested that after 40 years, maybe it was time to let go. But Emily couldn't. She spent hours researching missing children, reading about cases where people had been found decades after their disappearances, studying the handful of happy endings that proved that miracles could happen. When commercial DNA testing became available to the public in the early 2000s, Emily was fascinated. She read everything she could about how these tests worked, how they could connect family members who'd been separated, how they were being used to solve cold cases and identify unidentified remains. An idea began to form in her mind, tenuous at first, but growing stronger with each article she read, each success story she learned about. In 2025, at the age of 59, Emily Ward Mitchell made a decision. She ordered a DNA testing kit from one of the major genealogy websites. When it arrived in the mail, she carefully followed the instructions, swabbing the inside of her cheek and sealing the sample in the provided container. She filled out the paperwork, checking the box that would allow her results to be visible to others who might be searching for family connections. And then she mailed it off and waited. She didn't tell anyone what she'd done. Not her husband, not her daughters, not the few remaining friends who'd known her as a child and remembered Jacob. She didn't want to have to explain her reasoning, didn't want to see the pity in their eyes when they realized she was still holding on to hope after 53 years. This was something private, something personal, a last attempt to find answers before she grew too old to pursue them. 6 weeks later, she received an email notification that her results were ready. Her hands shook as she logged into the website and clicked to view her genetic matches. The system had found hundreds of matches, distant cousins and fourth-degree relatives whose names meant nothing to her. She scrolled through them, feeling disappointment begin to settle in. She wasn't sure what she'd expected, that Jacob would have coincidentally taken the same DNA test, that she'd somehow magically find him through genetic genealogy. It had been a long shot, a desperate attempt to do something, anything, when there was nothing else to be done. She was about to close the browser when she noticed something. The matches were listed by degree of relationship and amount of shared DNA. Most of hers were distant relatives, sharing tiny percentages. But there at the top of the list was a match that stood out. Approximately 2,500 centimorgans shared. The website's algorithm identified this person as a close family member. Sibling, half-sibling, parent, child. Emily's heart began to pound. Her parents were both dead. She had no other children besides her 2 daughters, and they hadn't taken DNA tests. She had no half-siblings that she knew of, which left only one possibility, one that seemed too impossible to even consider. The match's profile name was Robert M. 1972. The account had been created only a month ago. There was no photo, no additional information beyond the genetic data. Emily stared at the screen, her mind racing. 1972. Jacob had been born in 1972. Was it possible? Could it actually be possible? Her finger hovered over the message button. The website allowed users to send messages to their DNA matches. She could reach out. She could ask. But what would she say? And what if she was wrong? What if this was some other relative she'd never heard of? Some cousin or uncle's child, or some complicated family connection that had a perfectly ordinary explanation? But what if she was right? Emily took a deep breath and clicked the message button. For several minutes she stared at the blank text box, trying to compose her thoughts. Finally, she began to type, her fingers trembling so badly she had to delete and retype several times. Hello, my name is Emily Ward Mitchell. According to this website, we share enough DNA to be closely related. I don't know how to say this without it sounding strange, but I had a brother who disappeared when we were children, 53 years ago. His name was Jacob Ward. He was born in 1972. If you were adopted, or if you have any questions about your family history, I would very much like to speak with you. Please message me back. Sincerely, Emily. She read it over 3 times, changing a word here and there, trying to strike a balance between hope and caution. Finally, she hit send before she could second-guess herself. The message disappeared into the ether, sent to someone who was quite possibly her brother, or quite possibly a complete stranger who'd wonder why some random woman was sending them bizarre messages about long-lost siblings. Now, all she could do was wait. The next 24 hours were torture. Emily checked her email constantly, refreshing the page every few minutes, hoping to see a notification that she had a new message. Nothing came. She tried to go about her normal activities, but she couldn't focus on anything. Her mind kept circling back to that DNA match, to those 2,500 centimorgans, to the birth year 1972, to the possibility that after more than 50 years, she might have actually found her brother. Her husband noticed her distraction over dinner. "Are you okay? You seem a million miles away," Emily almost told him. The words were right there, ready to spill out, but she held back. Not yet. Not until she knew for sure. She didn't want to invite disappointment or concern. "I'm fine," she said. "Just tired." That night she barely slept, tossing and turning, alternating between hope and self-recrimination for even entertaining such a far-fetched possibility. Morning came, and still no response. She went through her day on autopilot, teaching her classes without really being present, her mind constantly wandering back to the unanswered message, sitting in someone's inbox somewhere. 3 days passed. Then 4. Emily began to lose hope. Maybe the person had seen her message and thought she was crazy. Maybe they'd blocked her. Maybe they rarely checked their account. Maybe they'd only submitted their DNA out of idle curiosity, and had no real interest in connecting with relatives. Maybe this whole thing had been a foolish waste of time and emotional energy. On the 5th day, as Emily was making dinner, her phone buzzed with a notification. New message from Robert M1972 on Ancestry DNA. Her hands went numb. She nearly dropped her phone. With shaking fingers, she opened the app and navigated to her messages. The message was short. "I think we need to talk. Can you call me?" And a phone number. Emily stood in her kitchen, staring at those few words, and the 10 digits that followed them. This was it. This was the moment when she'd either have her hopes confirmed or crushed. She looked at the clock. 6:15 p.m. Was it too late to call? Should she wait until morning? No. She couldn't wait. She'd waited 53 years. She wasn't waiting another minute. She went into her bedroom, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. She dialed the number before she could lose her nerve. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Emily's heart was hammering so hard she thought she might pass out. On the 4th ring, someone picked up. "Hello?" It was a man's voice, uncertain, tentative. "Hi, this is Emily, Emily Ward Mitchell. You sent me a message to call?" Yeah, I did." A pause. "I don't really know how to start this conversation." "Neither do I," Emily admitted. "Can I ask? Were you adopted?" Another pause, longer this time. "I was told I was adopted. Yeah. Informal adoption, my parents said. They told me they got me from a couple who couldn't take care of me anymore. Private arrangement. No official paperwork." This was back in the 70s. Emily's vision swam. She gripped the phone tighter. "What year?" 1972. Do you know where you're originally from?" "Missouri, I think. My parents never wanted to talk about it much. They were older when they got me, and they both passed away years ago. I never really pushed for details when they were alive. It wasn't until I took this DNA test on a whim that I started questioning things." "What's your birthday?" Emily asked. Though she already knew. Somehow she already knew what he was going to say. "April 14th, 1969. Emily made a sound that was half sob, half laugh. Jacob's birthday was April 14th, 1969. Silence on the other end of the line. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "My parents told me my name was Robert. They said the people who gave me to them had been calling me Bobby. But when I took the DNA test, I put 1972 as my birth year because that's when my parents said they got me. I was 3 years old. I don't remember anything from before." "Oh my God," Emily whispered. "Oh my God. It's really you. Jacob, it's really you." "I don't know if I'm ready to accept that yet," the man said, and Emily could hear that he was crying. "I don't. I don't remember anything. I don't remember you. I don't remember our parents. It's like you're telling me my entire life has been a lie. Not a lie, Emily said gently, tears streaming down her face. You were taken. You were stolen. On June 23, 1972, you were playing in our front yard and a man took you. I saw it happen. I was 6 years old and I saw it, and I've carried that memory every day for 53 years. We never stopped looking for you. Our parents died not knowing what happened to you. And now you're here. You're alive. Do you understand? You're alive. They talked for over 2 hours. Emily told him everything she remembered about that day. About their parents, about the house on Elm Street, and the white wooden fence, and the toy cars he'd loved. The man, who'd lived his entire adult life as Robert Martin, listened with a mixture of disbelief and dawning recognition. Some things Emily described sparked no memory at all, but others seemed to resonate in some deep, forgotten part of his mind. A teddy bear named Mr. Brown. He'd had a teddy bear as a child, a worn old thing his adopted parents said he'd come with. Was it the same one? By the end of the conversation, they'd agreed to have official DNA testing done through law enforcement to confirm the relationship. They'd also agreed to meet in person, though both were terrified of how that would go. Robert lived in Oklahoma, had built a life there, had a wife and adult children who were about to learn that their family history was completely different from what they'd believed. Emily called the Springfield Police Department Cold Case Unit the next morning. The detective who currently had responsibility for the Jacob Ward case, a young woman named Detective Sarah Chen, who'd only been assigned to it a year ago, listened with growing amazement as Emily explained about the DNA match. Chen immediately got her supervisor involved, and within hours, arrangements were being made to reopen the investigation. Robert Martin agreed to submit to formal DNA testing through law enforcement channels. Samples were taken from him and from Emily, and they were sent to the state crime lab. The results would take a few weeks, but everyone involved already knew what they'd show. The genetic match was too close, the circumstances too specific. This was Jacob Ward. The news broke 2 weeks later, before the official DNA results had even come back. Someone at the police department leaked it to a reporter, and suddenly the story was everywhere. National news picked it up. "Boy missing for 53 years found alive," read the headlines. It was the kind of miracle story that captured public imagination, the kind of case that gave people hope that impossible things could sometimes happen. When the official DNA results came back, they confirmed what everyone already knew. Robert Martin was Jacob Ward. The genetic evidence was irrefutable. Two siblings separated for more than 5 decades had found each other through a civilian DNA database, through pure chance and Emily's refusal to give up hope. The reunion took place at a hotel conference room in Springfield, neutral territory where they could meet away from media attention. Emily arrived early, pacing nervously, unable to sit still. When Robert walked in, escorted by Detective Chen, Emily's breath caught in her throat. She saw it immediately, the resemblance to their father in his jaw and his build, the echo of their mother in his eyes. This was her brother. After 53 years, this was Jacob. They stood awkwardly for a moment. Two strangers who were also family, both crying, neither quite sure how to bridge the impossible gap between them. Then Emily stepped forward and hugged him, and Robert hugged her back. And they stood there, holding each other while Detective Chen tactfully left the room to give them privacy. They spent the next several hours talking, looking through old photos Emily had brought, slowly building a bridge between past and present. Robert saw pictures of himself as a toddler, of the parents he had no memory of the house where he'd spent the first 3 years of his life. Emily told him stories about their parents, about how their mother had never given up hope, how she'd maintained his bedroom as a shrine until the day she died, how their father's heart had broken a little more each year he spent without answers. "I'm sorry," Robert kept saying. "I'm sorry I don't remember. I'm sorry they died without knowing." "It's not your fault," Emily told him firmly. "You were 3 years old. You were a victim. What happened to you wasn't your fault." The question that everyone wanted answered was obvious. Who had taken Jacob? How had a 3-year-old boy from Springfield, Missouri, ended up living as Robert Martin in Oklahoma? The couple who'd raised him, whom he'd always known as his parents, had died years ago, taking their secrets with them. But Detective Chen and the FBI agents who'd been brought back into the case began investigating. Through interviews with Robert's remaining extended family, through records, searches, and document analysis, a picture slowly began to emerge. The couple who'd raised Robert, James, and Ruth Martin had been in their 40s when they suddenly appeared with a 3-year-old child in 1972. They'd told neighbors and family that they'd arranged a private adoption with a young couple who couldn't care for the child. No one had questioned this story. Private adoptions were more common then, and paperwork requirements were less stringent in some states. But investigators now discovered something interesting. James Martin had worked as a delivery driver in 1972, a job that required him to travel throughout Missouri and neighboring states. His route had included Springfield. He drove a company truck, and while the company's records from 53 years ago were long gone, family photos showed James standing next to his delivery truck in the early 1970s. It was light blue. It was a Ford. The theory that investigators developed, based on circumstantial evidence and psychological profiling, was this. James and Ruth Martin had been unable to have children of their own. They'd become increasingly desperate to become parents. When James's delivery route took him through Springfield, he'd seen the Ward family, seen their young son playing in the front yard. Maybe he'd been watching for a while, or maybe it was a sudden impulse. But at some point, he'd decided to take Jacob. He'd approached the child, possibly claiming to be lost and asking for help, or offering candy, or using whatever story convinced a trusting 3-year-old to walk with him to his truck. He'd driven away with Jacob, taken him back to Oklahoma, and he and Ruth had simply claimed they'd adopted him. It was an imperfect theory, impossible to prove definitively, with both James and Ruth dead. But it fit the facts. It explained the blue Ford truck seen in the neighborhood. It explained how Jacob ended up in Oklahoma. It explained why there'd never been a ransom demand or any other contact from the abductor. James hadn't taken Jacob for money or for any sinister purpose beyond the desire to have a child. In James's mind, twisted though it was, he might have even believed he was doing something good, giving Jacob a loving home. The question of whether Ruth had been complicit or whether she'd truly believed they were adopting a child through legitimate channels would never be answered. Robert had vague memories of his childhood with the Martins, and by all accounts, they'd been loving parents who'd given him a stable, normal upbringing. He'd never been abused or neglected. He'd gone to school, played sports, had friends, lived an ordinary middle American life. The tragedy was that he'd been living that life under stolen circumstances, ripped away from his biological family, who'd spent decades searching for him. The case generated enormous media attention. Emily was interviewed on national television, telling Jacob's story, talking about the 53 years of not knowing, about the DNA test that had finally provided answers. Robert appeared alongside her, still processing everything, still struggling to reconcile his two identities. He was both Robert Martin, the 56-year-old man from Oklahoma, and Jacob Ward, the 3-year-old who'd vanished from a front yard in Springfield. The story sparked conversations about missing children, about cold cases, about the potential for DNA databases to solve decades-old mysteries. Other families with missing children reached out to Emily, asking for advice, hoping for their own miracles. Emily became an advocate for DNA testing in cold cases, speaking at conferences, working with law enforcement agencies, encouraging other families to never give up hope. For Emily, the reunion with her brother was both a dream come true and deeply bittersweet. She had her brother back, which was more than she'd ever thought possible. But he wasn't really the brother she remembered. He was a stranger with whom she shared DNA and a tragic history, but not memories, not experiences, not the kind of bond that siblings typically have. They were working to build a relationship, meeting regularly, talking on the phone, slowly learning about each other. Emily invited Robert to family gatherings and showed him the places their parents had taken them as children. Robert introduced Emily to his wife and children, expanding her family in ways she'd never imagined. The house on Elm Street where it had all happened no longer belonged to the Ward family. It had been sold after Mary's death, and the new owners had renovated it extensively. But Emily and Robert visited it together one afternoon, standing on the sidewalk, looking at the white fence that had been replaced at least twice since 1972, but still marked the same boundary. Emily pointed to where she'd been sitting with her notebook. Robert stood near the gate, trying to summon some memory, some fragment of recognition. Nothing came. That little boy who'd played in this yard was gone, locked away in a part of his mind he could never access. They visited their parents' graves together, Emily showing Robert where Daniel and Mary Ward were buried in the Springfield cemetery. Robert stood looking at the headstones, reading the names of people who were his parents, but whom he had no memory of, feeling a complicated mix of grief for people he'd never known, and guilt that he couldn't grieve them properly. Emily placed flowers on both graves, and told her parents, though they couldn't hear, that Jacob had been found, that he'd been alive all this time, that they could rest now knowing what had happened to their son. The investigation into James Martin's possible criminal actions continued, even though he couldn't be prosecuted since he died in 2009. Investigators wanted to know if there were other victims, if Jacob had been James's only abduction, or if there might be other families out there still searching for missing children. They combed through James's employment records, tracking his delivery routes over the years, cross-referencing them with unsolved child abduction cases from the same time periods. They found no evidence of other crimes, no pattern that suggested Jacob had been anything other than a one-time act driven by desperate desire for a child. Ruth Martin had died in 2015, taking whatever knowledge she'd had to her grave. Her sister, Robert's aunt, was interviewed extensively by investigators. She insisted that Ruth had always maintained the adoption was legitimate, that she'd shown her paperwork that the aunt had never actually examined closely. Whether Ruth had been complicit in the abduction or genuinely deceived by her husband was something no one would ever know for certain. Robert preferred to believe his mother had been innocent, that she'd truly thought she was adopting a child legally. It was easier than believing the woman who'd raised him had knowingly participated in child theft. The case raised interesting legal questions that lawyers and ethicists debated in academic journals and television talk shows. Robert had been raised by the man who abducted him. Those were the only parents he'd ever known. He'd loved them and they'd loved him. Did that make what happened any less horrific? Should the fact that he'd had a good childhood mitigate the crime of his kidnapping? What about the Ward family, who'd suffered for 53 years? What about the life Robert would have had if he'd grown up with his biological family? There were no easy answers. Robert struggled deeply with these questions. He felt guilty for having had a good childhood, while Emily and his parents had suffered. He felt confused about his identity, not sure whether he was Robert or Jacob, whether his life in Oklahoma was real, or if it had all been built on a lie. He sought therapy to help him process the trauma of learning that his entire existence had been founded on a crime. His wife stood by him, but their marriage was strained by the revelation, and the media attention and the psychological toll it took on Robert. Emily tried to give him space while also wanting to build a relationship with the brother she'd lost. It was a difficult balance. Sometimes Robert needed to talk to her, needed to hear stories about their parents, needed to connect with his biological family. Other times he needed distance, needed to retreat into the life he'd built as Robert Martin, the life that felt real even though it had started with a kidnapping. Emily tried to be understanding, tried to respect his boundaries, but it hurt when he pulled away. She'd waited 53 years to have her brother back. Part of her wanted to make up for all that lost time immediately, wanted to have the kind of close sibling relationship they'd been robbed of. Robert's children, now adults themselves, struggled to process what they'd learned about their family history. Their grandfather, whom they'd known as a kind man who taught them to fish and told corny jokes, had been a kidnapper. Their father wasn't who they'd thought he was. Their entire family tree had been rewritten. Some of Robert's extended family from the Martin side distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the association. Others rallied around him, insisting that James's crime didn't change who Robert was or the love they had for him. The media eventually moved on to other stories, as media always does. The incredible reunion of siblings, separated for 53 years, became old news, replaced by newer scandals and tragedies. Emily was grateful for the respite from public attention. She and Robert could begin building their relationship without cameras and reporters documenting every interaction. Slowly, over months and then years, they found their way to each other. It would never be the same as if they'd grown up together. They'd never have shared childhood memories or inside jokes or the kind of shorthand that siblings develop. But they built something new, something uniquely theirs. They talked regularly on the phone. They visited each other several times a year. Robert started calling Emily on her birthday, started remembering Christmas gifts, started integrating her into his life rather than keeping her at arm's length. Emily introduced Robert to her daughters, his nieces, who welcomed their newfound uncle with open arms. They were fascinated by the story, by the idea that their mother's baby brother, who'd been missing their entire lives, had suddenly appeared. Robert's children gradually warmed to Emily as well, seeing how important she was to their father, how much it meant to him to have reconnected with his biological family. The city of Springfield held a ceremony honoring the Ward family and recognizing the resolution of one of their oldest cold cases. The mayor spoke about never giving up hope. Sergeant Davis, now retired and in his 90s, attended in a wheelchair, telling reporters that he'd never thought he'd see this case solved in his lifetime. The current police chief announced that the department was implementing new protocols for utilizing DNA databases in cold cases, inspired by how Jacob had been found. Emily and Robert were asked to speak at the ceremony. Emily talked about her parents, about keeping Jacob's memory alive, about the importance of never stopping the search for missing children. Robert spoke more briefly, still uncomfortable with public speaking, thanking everyone who'd searched for him even though he hadn't known he was missing, acknowledging that while his story had a happy ending, too many missing children cases did not. At the end of the ceremony, they unveiled a plaque in the park near where the Ward family had lived. It commemorated Jacob Ward and all missing children, with a quote from Emily, "Hope is not foolish. Hope is what brings us home." Emily cried as she read the words engraved in bronze, thinking about her parents who'd never stopped hoping, never stopped believing that somehow, someday, they'd learn what happened to their son. The Springfield community embraced the story, proud that one of their coldest cases had been resolved, grateful for the reminder that miracles could happen. Local schools taught Jacob's story as part of their safety curriculum, using it as a cautionary tale about stranger danger, while also emphasizing the importance of DNA databases and forensic genealogy in solving crimes. The house on Elm Street became a minor landmark, with true crime enthusiasts occasionally driving by to see where the abduction had occurred. For Emily, life finally began to feel complete, in a way it hadn't since she was 6 years old. The hole that Jacob's disappearance had left in her life, the hole that had shaped every decision and every relationship, had been partially filled. Not completely, because the lost years could never be recovered and the trauma could never be undone. But knowing what had happened, knowing that Jacob had lived a good life, even if it was under different circumstances, brought a measure of peace she'd never expected to find. She retired from teaching and became a full-time advocate for missing children's causes. She worked with several organizations that used DNA databases to help solve cold cases. She spoke at conferences about the importance of submitting DNA samples if you had any questions about your family history, about how even the most hopeless cases could sometimes be resolved. She became friends with other families who'd had children returned after decades, forming a support network of people who understood the unique challenges of reunion after extraordinary separation. Robert eventually wrote a book about his experience, titled Two Lives: My Journey from Jacob to Robert and Back Again. In it, he explored his complicated feelings about his identity, about loving the parents who'd raised him, while acknowledging the crime that had brought him to them, about building a relationship with Emily, while grieving for the parents he'd never known. The book became a bestseller, resonating with readers who were fascinated by questions of nature versus nurture, by the resilience of the human spirit, by the power of hope. The book tour brought Emily and Robert even closer together. They did joint appearances, telling their story from both perspectives. Audiences were moved to tears, hearing Emily describe watching her 3-year-old brother disappear, then listening to Robert explain what it was like to learn at age 56 that your entire life had been built on a kidnapping. They complemented each other well. Emily's emotional openness, balanced by Robert's more reserved demeanor. Detective Sarah Chen, who'd been assigned to the cold case just before the breakthrough, wrote an academic paper about the investigation and how forensic genealogy had solved it. Her paper became required reading in criminal justice programs, used as a case study in how old cases could be revisited with new technology. Chen credited Emily's refusal to give up hope and her decision to upload her DNA to a civilian database as the key factors that had cracked the case. The FBI updated its training materials to include the Jacob Ward case as an example of effective use of DNA databases in cold case investigations. Agents were taught to encourage families of missing persons to submit their DNA to multiple databases, increasing the chances of a match if the missing person or their relatives ever did the same. The case also highlighted the importance of maintaining thorough case files, even for decades-old investigations, as the detailed records kept by the Springfield Police Department had been crucial in establishing Robert's identity and building the case against James Martin. As the years passed, and the initial media frenzy faded into memory, Emily and Robert settled into a comfortable routine. They had dinner together once a month, alternating between Oklahoma and Missouri. They celebrated holidays as an extended family, Emily's daughters and Robert's children gradually becoming close, as cousins often do. They texted each other funny memes and articles they thought the other would find interesting. They called each other when they needed advice or just wanted to hear a familiar voice. It wasn't the relationship they would have had if James Martin hadn't stolen a 3-year-old from his front yard in 1972, but it was real and meaningful, and built on a foundation of shared DNA, shared trauma, and shared determination to make the best of an impossible situation. They'd both lost so much, 53 years of being siblings, the chance to grow up together, the opportunity to support each other through life's challenges. But they'd found each other in the end, and that had to count for something. Emily often thought about the butterfly effect of that June morning. If she'd been paying closer attention, would she have seen James Martin approach in time to call out a warning? If their mother had been looking out the window at that precise moment, would Jacob still have been taken? If the gate latch had been higher, if Jacob had been playing in the backyard instead, if Daniel had been home that day, if any one of 1,000 small details had been different, would their lives have unfolded differently? But she'd learned through therapy and through her advocacy work that what if was a dangerous game to play. You could drive yourself mad thinking about all the ways tragedy might have been prevented. The only thing you could control was how you responded to tragedy, how you chose to move forward, whether you let grief destroy you, or whether you found a way to transmute it into something useful, something that might help others. Emily chose to help others. She volunteered with organizations that supported families of missing children. She donated to DNA database companies to help subsidize tests for families who couldn't afford them. She spoke at high schools about her experience, encouraging young people to pay attention to their surroundings and to trust their instincts if something felt wrong. She lobbied for better resources for cold case investigations, arguing that families deserved answers even decades after their loved ones disappeared. Robert supported her advocacy work, though he remained more private. He'd given one book tour, done one round of media interviews, and then retreated back into his life in Oklahoma. He was proud of Emily's work and grateful for the awareness she was raising, but he didn't have the same need to be public about their story. He processed his trauma privately, with his therapist and his family, slowly integrating his dual identities into a coherent sense of self. The question people asked him most often was whether he was angry at James Martin. Robert's answer was always complicated. Yes. He was angry that a crime had been committed, that his biological family had suffered, that he'd been denied the chance to know his parents and grow up with his sister. But he also couldn't completely hate the man who'd raised him, who'd taught him to ride a bike and helped him with homework and attended every one of his baseball games. James Martin had committed a terrible crime, but he'd also been a good father in many ways. Robert had to hold both truths simultaneously, and it was exhausting. Ruth Martin's memory was even more complicated. If she'd been complicit, if she'd known Jacob was kidnapped and had gone along with it anyway, then Robert's feelings toward her were much darker. But if she'd truly been deceived by her husband, if she'd genuinely believed they were adopting a child through legitimate channels, then she was as much a victim as anyone else. Robert would never know for sure, and he'd made peace with that uncertainty. He chose to remember the mother who'd loved him and cared for him, while acknowledging that her love had been built on a foundation of lies she may or may not have known about. Emily understood Robert's complicated feelings, even if she didn't entirely share them. For her, James Martin was the villain of their story. Period. He'd stolen her brother. He'd caused her parents decades of suffering. He'd robbed her of growing up with a sibling. She didn't care if he'd been a good father to Robert. Good fathers didn't kidnap children from their families. But she kept these feelings to herself, recognizing that Robert needed to process his relationship with his adoptive parents in his own way, on his own timeline. The annual anniversary of Jacob's disappearance, June 23rd, became a day that Emily and Robert spent together. Every year they'd meet, sometimes in Springfield, sometimes at Robert's home, sometimes at a neutral location. They'd talk about their lives, about their families, about how far they'd come since that devastating day in 1972. Sometimes they'd visit their parents' graves. Sometimes they'd just have a quiet dinner together. It was their day to remember and honor the little boy who'd been taken and the decades of pain that had followed, while also celebrating the miracle of his return. The media would occasionally revisit their story, particularly around milestone anniversaries. On the 5th anniversary of Robert being found, a major television network aired a 2-hour documentary about the case. Emily and Robert participated, along with Detective Chen, Sergeant Davis, and various other people involved in the investigation and search. The documentary included vintage news footage from 1972, showing Mary Ward's anguished face as she begged for her son's return, showing the massive volunteer search efforts, showing the community coming together in crisis. It was painful for Emily to watch her mother's grief captured on film, but it also felt important to document what the family had gone through. The documentary reignited public interest in the case. The Ancestry DNA company that had hosted the database where Emily and Robert matched saw a significant increase in people submitting samples. Many of them, families of missing persons hoping for their own miracles. Several other cold cases were solved in the months following the documentary, as people began checking DNA databases they'd previously ignored and making connections they'd never expected. Emily received hundreds of letters and emails from people who'd been touched by their story. Some were from other families of missing children, thanking her for giving them hope. Some were from adopted people who'd used DNA testing to find their biological families. Some were from people who just wanted to express their gratitude that the story had a happy ending, that sometimes lost children came home. Emily tried to respond to as many as she could, recognizing that their story meant something to people, that it represented possibility in a world that often felt hopeless. One letter, in particular, moved Emily deeply. It was from a woman in California whose son had been missing for 30 years. The woman wrote that she'd been on the verge of giving up, of accepting that she'd never know what happened to her child when she'd seen the documentary about Jacob. Emily's story had inspired her to submit her DNA to multiple databases, something she'd been putting off. 3 months after submitting her sample, she'd gotten a match. Her son had been found. He'd been taken by a family member and raised under a different name, not unlike Jacob's situation. The woman's letter thanked Emily for never giving up, for showing the world that miracles could happen even after decades. Emily framed that letter and hung it in her home office. Looking at it, whenever she felt discouraged about her advocacy work or wondered if she was making a difference. That woman's son had been found because Emily had been public about her own story. That family had been reunited because Emily had refused to be silent. It made all the media attention, an invasion of privacy, and exhausting interviews worthwhile. Robert started a foundation to help families afford DNA testing. Using some of the proceeds from his book, the Jacob Ward Foundation provided free DNA kits to families of missing persons who couldn't afford the $100 cost of commercial testing. The foundation also funded training for law enforcement officers in how to use forensic genealogy in cold case investigations. Within its first 3 years, the foundation had helped solve 15 cold cases, bringing closure to families who'd been waiting for decades. Emily served on the foundation's board, helping guide its mission and ensure that the families they served got not just DNA tests but also emotional support and resources. They partnered with victim advocacy groups and counseling services, recognizing that solving a cold case was just the beginning of a family's journey toward healing. The foundation became Robert's way of transforming his personal tragedy into something that helped others, giving meaning to the suffering his family had endured. The Springfield Police Department created an annual award in honor of the Ward family, given to officers or civilians who showed extraordinary dedication to solving cold cases or finding missing persons. Detective Chen was the first recipient, recognized for her work on Jacob's case and her subsequent efforts to implement DNA database protocols throughout the department. Sergeant Davis, though retired, attended the ceremony and presented the award, closing a circle that had begun 53 years earlier when he'd responded to Mary Ward's desperate phone call. As Emily entered her 60s, she began thinking about her legacy and what she wanted the Ward family story to represent. It was easy for people to focus on the happy ending, on the miraculous reunion after 53 years. But Emily wanted to ensure people also remembered the cost, the decades of suffering, the parents who died without answers, the childhood she and Robert had lost. The story wasn't just about hope and miracles. It was also about tragedy and loss, and the ways that crime ripples outward, affecting not just immediate victims, but entire communities across generations. She started writing her own book, a memoir about growing up as the sister of a missing child, about carrying guilt and grief through adolescence and adulthood, about never fitting in, because everyone knew her as the girl whose brother vanished, about the complex emotions of having Robert return to her life. She wrote about her parents' decline, about watching them age prematurely under the weight of not knowing, about the way their household had become a shrine to absence. She wrote honestly about her anger, her resentment, her moments of hope and despair. The book, titled The Empty Place, was published 2 years after Robert's book and offered a different perspective on the same events. Where Robert's book had focused on identity and adaptation, Emily's focused on endurance and memory. Critics praised it for its unflinching honesty, for refusing to make the story neater or happier than it had actually been. Emily dedicated it to her parents, Daniel and Mary Ward, who had loved their children with everything they had, and deserved to be remembered not just as the parents of a missing child, but as complete people who'd lived and loved and suffered. Robert wrote the foreword to Emily's book, acknowledging the pain his disappearance had caused, and honoring his sister's strength in carrying that pain for so long. He wrote about the guilt he felt knowing that his biological family had suffered while he'd lived an untroubled childhood, and about his admiration for Emily's resilience and determination. The foreword brought both siblings to tears when Emily first read it, the raw emotion of it cutting through the years of careful navigation they'd had to do around painful topics. The books, read together, provided a comprehensive picture of how a single crime could shatter multiple lives in different ways. They were assigned in criminal justice courses, in psychology programs, in sociology classes studying the long-term effects of trauma. Researchers cited them in studies about missing children, about adoption, about identity formation, about sibling relationships. The Ward siblings had become more than just people with an interesting story. They'd become case studies, examples, representatives of broader issues. Sometimes Emily found this exhausting, the way their personal tragedy had been transformed into public property, analyzed and discussed and dissected by strangers. But mostly, she was grateful that their suffering had meaning, that other people could learn from what they'd been through, that maybe some future tragedy could be prevented or resolved more quickly because of the attention their case had received. Emily and Robert's relationship continued to deepen as they moved through their 60s. They had the kind of comfort with each other that only comes with time, able to sit in companionable silence or finish each other's sentences. They'd created their own traditions, their own in-jokes, their own shorthand. It wasn't the relationship they would have had if they'd grown up together, but it was theirs, hard-won and precious. They talked sometimes about whether they'd change the past if they could. Would they prevent the abduction if given the chance, knowing that it would mean Robert would never have existed as Robert, would never have married his wife or had his children? It was an impossible question with no right answer. Emily would have spared her parents the suffering in a heartbeat. But she also loved her nephew and nieces, Robert's children, who wouldn't exist if James Martin hadn't kidnapped Jacob. The universe was complicated, and tragedy and joy were often inextricably intertwined. As they grew older, Emily and Robert made plans for how to handle their archives after they were gone. The case files, the news clippings, the letters from supporters, the documentation of their advocacy work. They wanted it all preserved, somewhere accessible to researchers and future generations. They worked with the University of Missouri to establish the Ward Family Collection in the library's Special Collections Department, ensuring that their story would be available to scholars studying missing children, forensic genealogy, or the social history of crime in America. They also established a scholarship fund for students studying criminal justice or forensic science, preferring to invest in the next generation of investigators who might solve future cold cases. The scholarship prioritized students from small towns like Springfield, recognizing that local law enforcement often had fewer resources but no less dedication than larger departments. In their 70s now, Emily and Robert moved more slowly, but remained active in their advocacy work. They gave fewer interviews, conserving their energy for the causes they cared about most. They focused on supporting the families who reached out to them, offering counsel and encouragement to people navigating their own tragedies, assuring them that even when hope seemed foolish, even when decades had passed, miracles could still happen. The house on Elm Street was sold again, and the new owners, aware of its history, reached out to Emily and Robert. They'd been considering putting up some kind of memorial marker, but wanted to know if that would be welcome or painful. After discussing it, Emily and Robert decided that a small plaque would be appropriate, something simple acknowledging what had happened there but not turning the property into a macabre tourist attraction. The plaque read, "On this site, on the 23rd of June 1972, 3-year-old Jacob Ward was taken from his family. After 53 years, he was found alive, a testament to hope and the power of never giving up. May all missing children find their way home." Emily and Robert attended the plaque's installation, standing in the yard where it had all begun so many decades ago. Emily was now in her late 70s, her hair white, her face lined with age. Robert was in his early 70s, still recognizable as the sandy-haired boy from the photos, even though that boy had grown into a gray-haired man. They held hands as the plaque was unveiled, two elderly siblings bound by biology, and trauma and determination, survivors of a tragedy that had tried to tear them apart but had ultimately failed. The media covered the plaque installation, noting how the Ward siblings were still working to keep the story alive, still advocating for missing children, still believing that hope mattered. A reporter asked Emily if she'd ever truly believed she'd find Jacob during those 53 years of searching. Emily paused, considering her answer carefully. "There were days I doubted," she admitted. "Days when hope felt impossible. But I never stopped looking. Because giving up on Jacob would have meant accepting that he was gone, and I wasn't ready to do that. I'd rather live with hope, even painful hope, than surrender to despair. And in the end, hope brought him home." This is the story of Jacob Ward, a little boy who vanished from his front yard in 1972 and came home 53 years later. It's a story about the cruelty of crime and the resilience of love. It's about a 6-year-old girl who carried guilt for decades, and a 3-year-old boy who lost his identity. It's about parents who died without answers, and a community that never stopped searching. But most of all, it's about hope, the stubborn, unreasonable, powerful force that keeps us looking even when all logic says to stop. If this story has moved you, if you believe in the power of hope and the importance of never giving up on missing children, please hit that subscribe button right now. Share this video with everyone you know. Leave a comment telling us your thoughts on Jacob's incredible journey. Together we can keep these stories alive. We can support families still searching, and we can ensure that every missing child has people who refuse to stop looking for them. This is Cold Case Reels, where we believe that justice delayed is not justice denied, and that sometimes, against all odds, the lost can be found. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next case.